There is a dinosaur skeleton in Jungle Falls, and you drive through it, entering through its mouth. This is a theme that happens at other points in the game, since you also enter Wizpig's mouth, the statue's mouth. To me, it suggests you're being eaten by these creatures, but also that you're being digested. I mean this because in the skeleton you enter and then you come out, so you exit the other end having been digested as poop. I think this makes sense in a game so linear as a racing game. You start at the start and end at the end. There's a line from one side to the other. You enter through the mouth and exit through the butt. It's like the body, a mirror of the body in video game form. A linear path through the organs towards the exit. In other games, let's say Zelda for example, you can explore wildly through the area, any place you want. There are a million possibilities for exploration which don't exist in Diddy Kong Racing. Here there are linear paths with a start and an end. There's another aspect of this I like, which is how you start as Dinosaur World and end as Space World, which is something I've already talked about. Dinosaur World is prehistoric, and Future World is like post-historic or something. It's too much into the future. It's the end of time. What takes us there is a lighthouse. So this lighthouse, right, let's look at it. It's something that warns ships when they are about to crash into an island. So, okay, it's like, thanks to this warning, the lighthouse, right, thanks to the lighthouse, we reach the future. The future wouldn't be reached if the ship crashed against the island, you could say. So you could also say that the ship reaching its destination without any deviations from course is what allows the future to arise. The deviations are prevented by the lighthouse because it keeps a constant light on the horizon, showing you where to go, the linear path you need to follow to reach the port. So you're not exploring the ocean in an open world adventure, you're going straight towards the lighthouse. In some cases, from what I can see, the lighthouses can actually mark dangerous areas, but I'd assume the Diddy Kong Racing one marks the port since that's where it's placed. If you drive through the levels directly towards the goal, you win. You can't deviate from course. Not if you want to beat the game and therefore reach the future post-game, once the game is out of your console. The game starts to resemble a game the closer it gets to the end of itself. First we get dinosaurs, medieval castles, etc. Right, so like eras where consoles and video games wouldn't have existed, and then we jump into space where things are futuristic, technological, console-like. The area looks like a game arcade with flashing lights, an amusement park of sorts. Right, it is a future fun land. If so, it's bold, but the game is exiting itself. It approaches realism, I think, to the maximum before needing to reach out for the world external to itself. So, for example, the game starts with a world distant to the players, the prehistoric and medieval worlds, then approaches the present day of the 90s at the time, or at least the video game culture you're participating in of the 90s, right? It approaches that sort of aesthetic, that sort of technological 90s video game aesthetic. And then once the game is over and you turn the console off, you're in an even more realistic version of the future portrayed in the game. So the game is slowly channeling you through more realistic depictions of your world until plopping you into it by the end of it. By leaving you no options other than to move forward, it's also avoiding repression of libido. By this I mean that you're not given the possibility to think about whether to go left or right, or whether to keep some tricks up your sleeve for strategy. For example, at the end, Timber is riding a dragon, as if finally having mastered the dragons that appeared in World 1. It's as if having reached the future has allowed him to finally master the past. I think it also highlights a relationship between birds and dragons which this game is trying to make. In this final scene, a dragon is portrayed as a flying winged creature. Birds are thought to be descendants of dinosaurs, and in this game there is a bird, Drumstick, the rooster, who disappears when going off to challenge Wizpig to a race. Drumstick is the heroic character here who valiantly charges off to beat the villain. He is transformed into a frog and has to be transformed back into a rooster by winning the game. So the game could be read as a process by which Drumstick is rescued from the state of frog to the state of bird. So my mind wanders to several directions here. First, we have Timber piloting the flying dragon as a celebration that the game has ended. We have Drumstick being liberated as also a sign that the game has been beaten. Both events are a sign of the end of the game. In a weird way, by beating the game, you're rescuing the past, rescuing the dinosaurs, or liberating them so they can fly free. Flight itself, tends to represent freedom, being unbound by prior limitations, and here, dragons maybe are something old, ancient, forgotten, that was buried and fossilized in the depths, but has now been brought back up, allowed to be free. I think it's interesting too what happens with the Drumstick story arc. Drumstick was the hero who was the best chance the characters had of beating Wizpig, but he goes off to challenge the villain and is never heard from again. The characters were relying on him to give them strength and help them beat the baddie, but instead, who do they get help from? Well, things get complicated here because I think it's two characters at once, Taj and Diddy. They get unrequested help from Taj, and they get requested help from Diddy. They write to Diddy for help, since Drumstick has disappeared. But they get help from Taj too, and the characters receive this help as a substitute of Drumstick's help. Right? Pipsy says, we could really do with Taj's help after the manual has reminded you that Drumstick, their main source of help, is missing. So what I'm trying to get at is that Taj is a substitute for Drumstick. At the same time, Diddy is too, since they ask him for help too, and of course, Diddy becomes the hero of the game, just as Drumstick was, since the game is called Diddy Kong Racing. So Diddy is the face, the main character of it. So something has happened by which one single character, Drumstick, right, has generated two characters to substitute him, Taj and Diddy. They both split off as substitutions of Drumstick as Drumstick disappears. So there's something about Taj that's pretty interesting too, and that's that he flies. He can fly just like Drumstick could. He hovers around on a carpet, so he represents flight, freedom too. He represents it doubly somehow by the irony that he's an elephant, an animal, which usually represents weight, heaviness, a large size, but he floats, which is something that usually small, nimble, light animals would do. It's funny then that Pipsy is the one who enters in contact with him, or that is contacted by him. The relationship between mice and elephants is very stereotypical in cartoons, etc. Say Dumbo, for example, since mice could be seen as the opposite of an elephant, a very tiny animal. So here, Pipsy and Taj may represent opposites, maybe big and small, light and heavy, a yin and yang sort of thing, and this is where communication happens between the mouse and the elephant. This is where a spiritual message is heard from the long disappeared genie of the island, or spirit of the island, right? He's the one who gives this message, and it happens precisely in between him and the character that is most opposite of him somehow. So he's the spirit of the mountain, and the mountain now has Wizpig's face on it. So this big, small yin-yang duality already points to the idea of two things being contained in a one unit that is made of two parts. So here too we see this maybe in the fact that Drumstick, one unified hero, is divided into two substitute helpers, Taj and Diddy, or that Drumstick himself acquires two identities, rooster and frog. It's interesting too that Diddy receives his message from a pigeon, a bird. If birds are being related by this game to spirituality or freedom of some kind, a sort of liberation, then flight is what brings Diddy his message. In fact, he explains how unusual it is for messages or letters to come by pigeon. A pigeon is a sign that it's a message from very far away, from a very, very distant land, a place not at all close to where he is now. It's funny then that the game should end by the whole crew lighting off into space, flying off into space, following the lighthouse that flies off too. The game sort of erupts outward into space and starts flying, as if flying was the main objective of what was happening. It's all leading up to this moment of liberation from the constraints that had been binding them. Another weird connection I see between Drumstick and these elements is that Drumstick is a rooster, and roosters call the arrival of the morning or the rising sun. When the sun rises, the rooster calls. Let's say this is a possible interpretation of what's going on, or my poetic reading. In that case, I find it nice that the game ends with a lighthouse emerging as the central element that leads us to the finale, because a lighthouse is also a light that emerges out of darkness, just as a sunrise is. So the rooster calls the rise of the morning, or of light, which would be awareness, being able to see things that were in darkness before, right? The game ends with a celebration of being able to see those things. Also, here's a slight speculation on the meaning of the bird in general. Diddy is alerted of his mission by a bird. In religion, I've seen birds represent spirit, as in the case of the Holy Spirit, but also other religions, at least I think, where a bird is an animal belonging to the sky, and therefore to the realms above the world of humans, up there. And so I think they represent something more elevated, morally speaking, giving a message that's above egoism. Pigs, on the other hand, have sadly been mythologically associated to greed, avarice, and egoic desires overall. Doing things that pleasure you and avoiding pain, but at all costs, regardless of the effects on other people. I think this game is showing a battle between collaboration and greed. Greed, the pig, has assailed the island, but a flying, elevated creature, be it a bird or a genie, has brought a message telling the ego, in this case the player, Diddy, to help conquer these egoic desires.